American diplomacy in the world under the Biden administration reached a new low in modern American history. It's hard to even find another period where we made so many self-inflicted mistakes and violated so much international agreements and the so-called rules-based order that we used to cherish, or at least claim that we did. And now here comes the Trump administration. At first, the idea was, well, he's focused on ending the war in Ukraine, so certainly there's plenty of room for advancement. It's hard to get any worse. And yet now that we have now going into 9 months of experience with the Trump administration, we find out that, in fact, there was new lows defined. And it's something that the United States better get fixed pretty quickly, or we can find that it's not just an embarrassment, but it could actually cause harm to our country. To try to help unpack this and try to explain why is Ambassador Chas Freeman, former U.S. Ambassador, Senior State Department and Defense Department official. Well, back when we had a Defense Department, now, of course, it's the War Department. So we might want to talk about that a little bit too. But first of all, Ambassador, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be with you, Danny.
And this a lot of stuff to discuss today, and I'm really grateful to have you on because of your exceptional experience in when it was done right, and you can really talk from the inside about some of the areas where it's really most pronounced right now. And you certainly would have to say China and the Middle East and in the Eurasian continent at large, and you have experience in all of those. I want to start off first of all, just because this is like, wait a minute, did he really say that? Over the weekend, our not really a formal ambassador, but certainly our envoy, the presidential envoy to the Ukraine side in the Russia-Ukraine war, which Trump has been trying to get hold of or end up, is former National Security Advisor Keith Kellogg. He used to be the National Security Advisor for the Vice President Pence under the Trump's first term. So obviously somebody very experienced, a former, I believe, retired 4-star general or 3-star general.
3-star.
And so he's got lots of paper experience. And so you're thinking, okay, well, he certainly should know how things work. But then he says this over the weekend.
If he was winning, he'd be in Kyiv. If he was winning, he'd be west of the Dnieper River. If he was winning, he'd be on Odessa. If he was winning, he would have changed the government. Russia is, in fact, losing this war. Now, they may make movements and say, so, well, they're advancing in the Donbass region and the Donetsk. But if you consider advancing moving by meters, not miles, well, then, okay, that's successful. But at the cost they're having, it's enormous. And I don't think people truly appreciate it. It's a number. But the numbers they have lost, when you're talking dead and wounded, well over 1 million, they left Afghanistan after losing 18,000. We left Vietnam after losing 65,000. They've lost over 1 million dead or wounded. These numbers are World War II level numbers when you think about it. They're stunning in the loss. And this is and their first line units that they came and tried to take Kyiv with a little over four years ago. Those first line units are gone. So they've gone through a second or a third or fourth iteration of wartime commanders. Russia is in fact losing this war.
I asked Gary to roll that comment there twice and add it back to the end. I mean, anything that follows that is just almost like, wait, what are you talking about? What do you make about the impression that this gives on the international stage? And I'm not just talking about among our friends, but among our adversaries, you're just onlookers.
Well, there are quite a number of appropriate responses to that nonsense. First of all, we've inhaled our own propaganda. We are not basing our policy on empirical examination of what is happening, but on a priori reasoning, deduction from our own view of what ought to happen. The numbers that the good general cites are completely bogus. The notion that somehow you're losing the war when you're advancing presupposes that you have objectives that the Russians don't have. Like conquering all of Ukraine, or like taking Kyiv. There's some question about what the purpose of the column that approached Kyiv at the beginning of the war was, whether that was a tactical maneuver to tie up Ukrainian troops and divert them from the Donbass, or whether it was a serious effort to take Kyiv. And there's very little evidence that it was a serious effort. The Russians sat there and took great punishment. And in fact, the forces opposite the Russian separatists in the Donbass were diverted as I guess they might have wanted. So There are lots of examples in our history of self-deception, and maybe we can talk about a couple of them. One of them, actually very well known, is the demise of the China hands. Who lost China? You know, people who actually observed what was going on and predicted that the Chinese nationalists were not winning their war against either the Japanese or the Chinese communists, were cashiered. First of those guys, interestingly, was a Colonel David Barrett. At that time, we had 14 consulates in China. He was assigned to Jinan, the capital of Shandong province, opposite Korea. He had the temerity to report on the basis of first-hand contact and observation that the Chinese nationalists were spending more time fighting the Chinese communists than they were fighting the Japanese, and that they were colluding with the Japanese. His reports got back to Washington, to the Pentagon, were read by people who were sympathetic to Chiang Kai-shek, and he was in real trouble. And eventually he lost his career. But we've seen a lot of this on the diplomatic side as well. I won't go on, but I happen to have worked in both of the areas where this has been the most acute problem, one being East Asia and the other West Asia, Middle East. In both cases, we hear what we want to hear, we reject what we don't want to hear, and we exemplify the causes of strategic surprise. Strategic surprise occurs when unwelcome information encounters an entrenched policy preference. That is what is going on now in all three of the theaters that you mentioned: Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, and China. This can be fatal. You can argue that the reason we made such a major strategic blunder in Indochina, in the Vietnam War, was because our expertise about the region was stripped from us by people enforcing political correctness under McCarthy. Mm-hmm. You could argue that the reason that we have ended up supporting genocide and losing our global reputation in West Asia is because people who understood the Arab world were too intimidated by the Israel lobby to report what they saw. And if they did report it, anything critical of Israel, either in its foreign policy or its domestic politics, immediately drew retribution from the Zionist lobby in the United States. You pay a price for this kind of thing. And we're paying it in Ukraine, in my view.
There's no question about that. There's a lot of price to be paid, and certainly a lot of truth. This comment here from our viewer, Nikos. Oops, sorry, wrong one there. Now, I'm going to play a soundbite. You Ukraine, so let's go ahead and talk about that. I'm going to play a soundbite here, and we kind of have a new feature on the show here, just out of self-preservation. Because a number of the sound bites that we have trigger some people. So we kind of want to have a little warning here that we have a sound bite coming up from Volodymyr Zelensky, who in this case is going to be talking about the sanctions and what he wants President Trump to do.
Хочу сьогодні особливо подякувати усім нашим воїнам, які завдають Росії дійсно значимих втрат на фронті, втрат при кордоні, втрат на власній території Росії завдяки нашим далекобійним ударам. Найбільш ефективні санкції, які діють найшвидше – це вогонь на російських нафтових заводах, на їхніх терміналах, нафтобазах. Суттєво обмежили російську нафтову галузь. І це суттєво обмежує війну. Російська війна – це фактично функція нафти, функція газу, усіх інших російських енергоресурсів.
Now, he's partly right there, and I hope nobody's triggered by that. But they certainly have inflicted losses on the Russians at the border, at the front line, the Donbass, et cetera. And they have indeed been firing long-range drones and hitting Russian oil infrastructure. No question about that. But it's a fraction of what they're receiving at the same time. So you have to view things in a net. And yet he's trying to say these things to a Western audiences to say, hey, look at all the great things we're doing. Give us more of this stuff. And it seems that message is falling on happy ears in the West. What do you make of that?
Well, the West has come up with a coalition of the deluded, as I call them. I think General Kellogg is playing to that audience. We believe what we want to believe. People basically accept the narrative in order to rally support for the cause that they're advocating, and Zelensky is doing just that. Not surprising, but he's absolutely wrong. And again, I go back to the example of Vietnam, or you could take Afghanistan as an example. Wars are not won by false information and self-congratulation, body bag counts, and other nonsense. They're won because people on one side have the will as well as the capability to persevere. And everything he just described plays in against Ukraine in the sense that it simply stiffens Russian resolve and rallies people behind the cause. I'm hurting Russia. What do you suppose the Russian response to that is? It's patriotic anger. And I go back to, again, Vietnam, Afghanistan. In Vietnam, the United States had every advantage technologically and otherwise, but we did not have the will. We did not have the balance of fervor on our side. Our interests, those that were at stake, were not equivalent to those that were at stake for the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese communist opposition to the regime we had installed. Same was true in Afghanistan. We went, as your commentator, your listener noted, from the Taliban to the Taliban, despite 20 years of effort. So the Russians are deadly serious about achieving their objectives, and their objectives are not aimed at extinguishing Ukrainian independence. They accepted that when the Soviet Union broke up on the basis that Ukraine would be neutral and not pose a threat to Russia. Ukraine violated that understanding. NATO did. They will not allow foreign troops and foreign weaponry aimed at them to be stationed in Ukraine. So when Europeans talk about resilience and reassurance forces and that sort of thing, they're smoking dope. It's not going to happen. And when General Kellogg says, well, they're only advancing cautiously, therefore they're losing, this is a very peculiar notion indeed. In fact, all of the serious military analysts that I've heard believe that the Russians have been very careful to put themselves in positions where they can deal with the Ukrainians as a meat grinder. They're not throwing troops wantonly at the Ukrainian defenses. They're playing this carefully. They're making tactical advances. And at the moment, the Ukrainian army along the front lacks the manpower, lacks the trained troops, lacks the ability to stand its ground, and it is crumbling slowly. Now, I don't want to disparage the Ukrainians. I think they've been unbelievably brave. They've been innovative. And when General Kellogg says, the Russians have lost various generals in this war. Yeah, the Russians have learned a lot from this war, and including improving their command system and the way in which they conduct the war. And God help us if we go up against the Russians, which we're risking doing with this proxy war, without making the appropriate reforms on our own side. We're still telling the Ukrainians how to suck eggs. They're not our grandmother, and they learned a lot. And we're setting them up, in my view, politically, for us to blame them for losing a war that they never should have been pushed into, that we maneuvered them into, and we have abused the Ukrainians, and I feel sorry for them.
I do as well. You mentioned, interestingly, that the will to fight is something that really is what determines the war. And certainly you can make the case that the Ukrainians have a will to fight and a will to win, but it takes more than that. Now, Gary, I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball here. I want to play that other Kellogg soundbite that we had from that same interview that I just showed you a bit of a while ago, because here he talks about why it's the Ukrainian side who wants to win, which will overcome all of the military difficulties.
Do you ever wake up in a cold sweat, fearing that Ukraine could end up sharing the fate of South Vietnam? That is to say, we could negotiate a peace, and it could seem to be a breakthrough, but in the end, Ukraine doesn't survive as an independent state in the same way that South Vietnam did not. Is that the nightmare?
Yeah, no, I don't have that nightmare at all, because Ukraine will survive. And the reason for that is because you look at the resiliency of the people. Look, I'll give you an example, and I actually put it on my phone. And it gives you, and I tell people, this kind of gives you an attitude of what this looks like going into the future. And there was a recent, it was put on TikTok or something, that the attacks had gone on. They were people, Ukrainian citizens were in the subway, and sitting in the subway, and they weren't huddled down, eating or drinking. You know what they were doing? They were singing their national anthem. You cannot replicate that. You can't. And that's the fighting heart of a country. That's not going to happen to Ukraine.
So certainly a heartwarming moment. I think I might have even seen that video at one point or another. But is that enough to win a war?
Save your wooden nickels. The South will rise again. I mean, will and even capability are not necessarily enough to win a war. The balance of fervor, as I mentioned, counts for a great deal. A little guy whose wife is insulted by a big guy in a bar can win a fight with that big guy because he cares more than the big guy does. The South Vietnamese, I think General Kellogg was insulting the South Vietnamese, who put up a very brave front. We cut off support to South Vietnam. Let's not forget that. They didn't give up. We pulled the plug on that. In Afghanistan, the Afghans who were supporting us in our effort to pacify the country did not give up. We pulled the plug on them. We left because we finally realized we were losing. And it does not help to be Pollyannish about these things. You have to be a realist. Sometimes conducting a retreat is necessary, and it is more difficult than mounting an attack. And so I think the Ukrainians have shown an enormously impressive spirit defending their country. They also, I have to say, did some things that brought this on them, like persecuting the Russian-speaking minority in their country, burning Russian books, banning the Russian Orthodox Church, eliminating democratic parties, taking over all the media and bending it to ultranationalist propaganda. This is not a one-sided story, but I don't think General Kellogg has a monopoly on admiration for Ukrainian bravery and spirit. It deserves our respect.
But it doesn't deserve to be thrown in the garbage when it can't alone even survive, much less win the war. You talked about some Pollyannish thing and as we talked about at the top of the show, just confusion and chaos and what even is American diplomacy and what are its objectives and what are its strategy and what are we even trying to accomplish. That keeps getting more and more chaotic the closer you get to the top in President Trump. He dropped a big bombshell over the weekend where he gave an ultimatum on Truth Social, not so much to Russia as much as it was to NATO, where he basically says, I'm ready to do, not basically, he actually wrote, I am ready to do major sanctions on Russia when all NATO nations have agreed and started to do the same thing. And when all NATO nations stop buying oil from Russia, as you know, NATO's commitment to win has been far less than 100%. And the purchase of Russian oil by some has been shocking. And then he goes on to say toward the end, if NATO does as I say, the war will end quickly and all of those lives will be saved. If not, you're just wasting my time and energy and money of the United States. What is this signal diplomatically? And let's start first of all with our allies in NATO.
Well, it basically reiterates and reaffirms what Henry Kissinger once quipped, and that was, it's dangerous to be the enemy of the United States, but to be the friend of the United States can be fatal. And that is exactly why he's punishing allies and countries, non-aligned countries like India, whom we've spent decades courting. India has not altered its non-aligned policies. It retains a close relationship with Russia. We've pushed it into a rapprochement with China. So here is a good example of the problems of, let me use the word, dictatorship. You don't tell the dictator anything that he doesn't want to hear, or you get fired. Look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics head. Look at the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Look at a lot of generals and a lot of diplomats. And so the worst thing you can do if you are a servant of your country, a patriotic servant of your country, is withhold criticism. But if you do criticize the assumptions, fallacious assumptions of your leader, and those assumptions that President Trump has just stated about how the war will end are completely baseless. If you do criticize that, you put yourself in jeopardy. You ruin your career. You end up out on the street. And that is why we have a letter from 300 retired diplomats and national security officials lamenting, warning that the American diplomatic service, our intelligence services, are now scared to report the truth. As I indicated, we've had previous examples of this, and they've all led to disaster. And this is setting us up for a disaster. Basically, if you're following a difficult path, you don't put your eyes out and chop your ears off. And that is what we are doing.
Gary, if you could put that headline up there, actually, we have an NBC report about that. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what this means. We'll just go down this path here because there's the issue here on the inside of the diplomatic corps. Is U.S. diplomats say they're reluctant to share inconvenient truths with the Trump administration, to your point exactly here. And then you see part of this this article. Apparently, it's from the I guess the group that is the not runs, but what is it? The
American Foreign Service Association.
Yeah. The American Foreign Service. Yeah. I wonder if you can tell us first of all what that is, but then also they're warning to their people inside that we are operating in uncharted territory. The environment facing the Foreign Service today is unlike anything we've ever seen. What is the meaning behind this?
Well, first of all, AFSA, the American Foreign Service Association, is the professional association of American career diplomats. It's also functioned as a bargaining agent for them with management within the Department of State. But it is dedicated to preserving professionalism and enhancing it. The environment that they're talking about is one in which any dissent, any questioning of the prejudices, the biases that inform our current administration leads to punishment, reassignment, or selection out, as the phrase goes, which means being fired, lack of promotion opportunities, career wrecking your career. So people are intimidated. And this is what I was referring to earlier. So we go back in the case of China, there were quite a number of people who had their careers completely truncated. When I worked on the China desk, which was in the mid-late 60s and early 70s, I actually had the desk of John Stewart Service, who was arrested by the FBI, hauled out in handcuffs from the State Department on entirely spurious charges. What was his crime? he predicted that the Chinese communists were going to win the Civil War in China. He was right. The worst thing you can do in our service, apparently, is to be right. John Patton Davies, similarly, charged with disloyalty by McCarthy because he'd made the same prediction, exonerated on multiple occasions by review boards, career wrecked. John Ford, another example. Owen Lattimore, and this gets to the state of our country at present, an academic, not a Foreign Service officer, expert on China, who also predicted that the Chinese Communist Party was going to win the Civil War, hounded out of his position at Harvard, I believe, persecuted, called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and castigated for having politically incorrect views. And so it goes. I mentioned the Colonel Barrett in Shandong in the late 1930s, when we had defense attachés at one of the 14 consulates we had in China, reporting that the Chiang Kai-shek's forces were colluding with the Japanese and spending more time fighting the communists than the Japanese. Again, we lost a huge amount of expertise. I remember when I first went into the Foreign Service and went to the State Department, you had to tiptoe around anything that was remotely critical of Chiang Kai-shek and the Republic of China and Taiwan. And you couldn't say, we really should recognize that the Civil War was lost by Chiang Kai-shek, and there's another government in charge in Beijing, and you have to be realistic whether you like it or not and deal with it. You couldn't say that. We had to call Beijing, which means northern capital in Chinese, Beiping, northern peace, because that was the name that Chiang Kai-shek insisted upon. He didn't want to recognize that it was the capital of anything.
Now, when you're talking about these things, was that like public-facing comments? They had to say those things, or was that even internal?
Both. I mean, there was intimidation. You could be turned in by your colleagues, and we have the same thing operating in the Middle East. Robert Kaplan, who is a very brilliant author and someone I have great respect for, came up to my house in Rhode Island and interviewed me for a book he wrote called The Arabists. Arabist was the Israeli term for anybody who knew anything about the Arab world. And the charge was that if you knew anything about the Arab world, you probably were anti-Semitic because the Arabs didn't like Israel. So he labeled me an Arabist. Actually, I came very late to that role. I never wanted to serve in the Middle East because it was where hypocrisy first got a bad name. Anyway, the level of expertise that we mustered was greatly diminished by the fact that we had internal political thought police. In the case of the Middle East, egged on by congressional posturing to appease what later became AIPAC.
So let me ask you this question, and this may apply more prior to Donald Trump than afterwards, because I think it's kind of a different set of rules here. But under ordinary conditions, I can kind of get the forward-facing stuff, because you want to, whatever message you want to have, whatever your strategy is, you want everything to be kind of in line with that. But it seems like it would also be in your interest to have all these experts giving you the real information, the truth, so that you knew if your policies would succeed or not, and you would want a diversity of views on there so you consider it. Why is that not the case?
We spend $80 billion a year to do just what you recommended. That's what we spend on intelligence. About 70% of analysis by the intelligence community traditionally has been based on diplomatic reporting. Now, I mean, you can go, if you're a good diplomat, if you're competent, you will gain the confidence of people in the local government that you're accredited to, and you will learn what they're really thinking as opposed to what Caroline Leavitt thinks they're thinking, or the equivalent of Caroline Leavitt thinks they're thinking. And you will report that, and you will try to protect them. if they say something that their own government might object to, which you hope they do, because that's honest. Of course, WikiLeaks did damage to the confidentiality of those relationships. And intelligence paranoia has done a lot of damage to our ability to develop expertise. For example, if you're a student and you go to study in China, you're very unlikely to get a security clearance. I found it really extraordinary. During the Cold War, we faced the most formidable intelligence enemy we've ever faced, the KGB. They had moles they had agents in our government. Not very many, but enough. The Soviet Union imploded, but instead of becoming more relaxed about our enemy, which was then a bunch of men with beards and lice hiding in the caves of Waziristan, or jihadis on the battlefield, with no capability to send agents into our midst, no professional intelligence service worthy of the name, we became more paranoid. We've become ever more paranoid in national security terms. Well, look, if you're going to depend on China specialists or specialists on the Arab world who've never even been there, who don't speak the language, who have no idea how people think on the other side, you're really setting yourself up for a disaster. And I'm not surprised we're seeing disasters. You can't blame all of this on Donald Trump or the Trump administration. This has been a progressive function, development. And let me go back and say, during the Cold War, John F. Kennedy said correctly, if I make a mistake in domestic affairs, it can embarrass me. But if I make a mistake in foreign affairs, it could kill us all. There was a sense of the gravity of the interests at stake and the need to be professional and cautious that largely disappeared after the end of the Cold War. Do we need a foreign policy? Well, maybe not. Let's turn it over to domestic special interests. We'll let the Black Caucus run Haiti policy because Haitians are Black, and we'll let the Save the Whales crowd run policy toward Norway because Norwegians hunt whales, and we will turn over Middle East policy to the Israel lobby, and we'll turn China policy over to every little group we can think of, apostles of the freedom of religion, devotees of the Dalai Lama, blah 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 blah, and lots of competing interests, all going against China. We now have at the top of our government Donald Trump, who never went to China until he went in 2018 on an official visit. Peter Navarro, his principal trade advisor, who had never been to China despite making a career on China bashing, writing a book called Death by China, never went to China again until 2018 when he was there as part of an official delegation. Marco Rubio, who's never been to China and in fact has been banned by the Chinese from getting a visa for being vociferously anti-Chinese.
Oh, wow.
Pete Hegseth, who's never been to China, knows nothing about it. And yet, we claim this is our principal adversary, and we are competing with him. Well, how are we competing with him? We're competing with him with some kind of masturbatory fantasy. It's not real, and we are deluding ourselves in the process. We can't afford this. Our freedom of maneuver as a country is constricted beyond any point in the recent past. More is at stake, and yet we are basically curtailing our hands, our eyes, and ears abroad.
So let me ask you this question: given all those statements about kind of the difficulty inside, the institutional pressures, et cetera, the lack of expertise, the fear of saying the wrong thing, et cetera, but then I think maybe you can add on the top layer of when the president says something, it's not all his fault, and I agree wholeheartedly with you on that. But man, you have to consider the guy at the top. And so I showed you that from Saturday, that ultimatum that he sent off to NATO, and then on Sunday, he was again asked, where is this war going and will it succeed? Tell me.
I want to stop the killing. So it just came out, or I think it came out, but I know for a fact, almost 8,000 young soldiers died this week between the two countries. A little bit more from Russia, but divided. When you're the aggressor, you lose more. I don't know if you know that, but in war, when you're the aggressor, you tend to lose more. But it was a little bit more for Russia, but it was 8,000, a little bit more than 8,017, actually, died this week in that war. Why? And they're Russians. They're not American soldiers, but they're still human beings. They're souls. And I want to stop them. And I stopped 7 wars. I thought this was going to be an easy one for me, but this has turned out to be tough. The hatred between Zelensky and Putin is unfathomable.
People believe that they will talk, that they will have a...
I don't know. I think I'm going to have to do all the talking. They hate each other.
When do you think that will take place?
I don't know. Relatively soon.
Has any of the NATO...
We're going to get it worked out one way or the other, but relatively soon.
Has any of the NATO...
They hate each other so much they can't breathe.
So what do you think that people who are in the diplomatic world and know that there's no way in hell that you're going to get Russia to agree to something to their disadvantage when they have the power dynamics to compel compliance on their side? And you hear them say stuff, oh, we're going to get this done. I'll have to talk to them because they hate each other so much. What impact does that have on our foreign policy apparatus?
Well, there's several elements to that. One is the president's attitude that it's all about me, about Donald Trump. Well, it isn't all about Donald Trump. There's an objective world out there, which is inhabited by other people with egos and ambitions and ideas and interests. Second, personalizing this is all about the personal hatred between Zelensky and Putin. It's nonsense. This is about serious issues. It's about Russia coping with a perceived threat from NATO. It's about Zelensky and Ukraine defending themselves in a war that basically was provoked by NATO enlargement, if you're honest, not anything that the Russians wanted. Those casualty figures, by the way, sound like it came from Fox News. They didn't come from an intelligence report. And here, just to go back to the other theme, just think what happened to Tulsi Gabbard when she contradicted the president. Think what happened to the head of DIA when he said, actually, we didn't obliterate the Iranian nuclear program. If you won't take honest advice, you're setting yourself up for the fall. So I really hope that Donald Trump will listen to people instead of, as he said in that clip, do all the talking.
And one of the other factors there, you mentioned that there are many competing interests, one of which is the Russian side. Dmitry Peskov earlier today tried to put cool the jets on a lot of this talk here and pour a little bit of cold water on this idea that things are going to be moving quickly. Gary, if you could put that full screen up there, the one from Peskov. No, that's the G7 one. Yeah, that's the one there. Let's see. The Peskov said the channels of communication exist and are established. Our negotiators are able to use them to communicate. However, at the moment, it's fair to say things are more on pause than active intervention. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters it's important not to wear rose-tinted colored glasses or expect that negotiation process will deliver lightning-fast results. I want to remind you that President Trump's own words. At first, he thought it would be settled quickly, but then later realized it would take more time, Peskov said. But Russia remains committed to pursuing peaceful dialogue. What diplomatically, what does this tell you?
Well, we continue, apparently, judging by President Trump's statement in the earlier clip, to focus on a ceasefire. But a ceasefire doesn't end wars. Wars end with ceasefires. You have to have a peace in order to make a ceasefire work. And there's no ceasefire in prospect. Both sides are dug in. Ukraine desperately wants to at least not lose more territory, maybe recover the territories it's already lost. Russia desperately wants to get rid of Western troops and and weaponry in Ukraine that is aimed at it. I understand the Russian attitude. Any American who went through the Cuban Missile Crisis could understand it. Cuba is not free to ally itself with an enemy of the United States and not expect reprisal. We will act just as we acted after our Civil War against the French presence in Mexico, which we felt threatened the Monroe Doctrine and our place in the hemisphere. So what is at stake here is serious issues for both sides. It's not personal animosity. It's not a failure of imagination. Both sides are determined, and they will reach a point at which one of them will understand that continuing the war is not going to gain anything further for it or cause it to lose more if it does. And I'm sorry to say, I really am, that the side that will fold in the end is Ukraine for several reasons. First, the coalition of the deluded that I mentioned in Europe does not have either the financial wherewithal or the military production capability or the courage to enable Ukraine to stand up to the Russians. We have cleverly handed this issue off to the Europeans so our arms manufacturers can profit by selling the Europeans weapons, which they will transfer to the Ukrainians. But they don't have an infinite amount of money. All of them are suffering domestically from politics that object to austerity and rearmament, which is the course that they're on. So that isn't going to help Ukraine. Ukraine's manpower is limited and attrited. Ukraine is losing ground on the battlefield. We now see maps behind the Russian commanders of this campaign, which show Odessa and Nikolaev, as well as the four Donbass provinces and the Crimea, as part of Novorossiya, Russia, annexed by Russia. Ukraine risks becoming a landlocked country with no Black Sea coast, and the Russians will just let it stew in its own juice. They don't want a lot of angry anti-Russian Western Ukrainians on their hands. If Ukraine is independent with those guys in charge, okay, so be it. Maybe they can make it into the European Union, although in order to do that, they'd have to restore democracy, abolish corruption, get their act together in agriculturally and industrially, and they'd face vested interests in Europe, like the French agricultural sector, that don't want them in the European Union. But, the best thing that could happen to Ukraine would be an accession process to the European Union, which would force them to do those things, address corruption, lack of democratic freedoms, and so forth. They're a long way from that.
Yeah.
So I think Mr. Peskov, sadly, is right. This is going to go on for a while, and it's all turning into the advantage of the Russians, not the Ukrainians, which means that the Russians don't have much incentive to stop if Ukraine isn't offering us a stable peace, which it isn't. And
Well,
finally,
now you mentioned that some of the Europeans, I guess earlier, at least on the news I saw, it was this morning, Polish Foreign Minister Sikorski has a grand idea, actually a resurrected idea. It was rejected during the the Biden administration, but now he wants a no-fly zone to protect Europe from Russian strikes. We, as NATO and the EU, could be capable of doing this, but it is not a decision that Poland can make alone. It can only be made with its allies. Protection for our population, for example, from falling debris, mentioning the drones that were allegedly passed from Russia into Poland over the weekend, would naturally be greater if we could combat drones and other flying objects beyond our territorial integrity. If Ukraine were to ask us to shoot them down over its territory, that would be advantageous for us. Now, what do you suppose would be the reaction in Russia if Polish aircraft started shooting down Russian drones on Ukrainian territory?
well, it wouldn't just be Russian drones. Drones and other flying objects, he says. I have great respect for the Poles. They have faced up to their geopolitical situation. They're now spending over 4% of their GDP on defense. They have developed a formidable relationship with South Korea. Their aircraft, their tanks, their armored fighting vehicles are all coming from there. They have, they're in a political military sense, they've done everything right. I don't know why the drones got over Poland, but I think the most plausible explanation is electronic warfare disrupted their navigation ability. I mean, this is an area of very intense efforts to confuse the navigation systems aboard drones, and it may have worked. In any event, I don't automatically jump to the conclusion, as NATO prefers to do, that this was some probe of NATO's resolve. I don't think the Russians want to take on the Poles. And I think here's the basic point, Danny. Europeans, the coalition of the deluded, have not put forward a peace proposal of any kind. Every proposal they've made has been how to continue the war, how to expand it. This falls into that category. If Poland starts shooting at Russians over Ukraine, the Russians are going to shoot back. And they've already said this. Think about the German debate over whether to supply the Taurus missile to Ukraine. Russians said, if you do that, we will take out the factory where they're made in Germany. So the Germans decided, okay, we'll just ship parts to Ukraine. They can assemble the parts in Ukraine. The Russians then took out the assembly plant. I mean, do not underestimate the seriousness of purpose of your enemy, whoever that may be, whether it's North Korea, North Vietnam, the Taliban, whoever, the Iraqi insurgents, whoever it is. You can't assume that because you bash them, they're just going to give up. Or because you escalate, they're not going to counter-escalate. So much as I respect Mr. Sikorsky, I know him personally from years ago when I was at the Defense Department. I think he's all wet on this subject.
Well, that pretty well clears that up in terms of, I mean, it's kind of it's a bad situation here, and we'll just keep seeing what ends up happening, and probably it is going to get drug out for a lot longer, to the chagrin and probably the ultimate demise of the Ukrainian armed forces. In the remaining time I got with you, though, I want to shift gears over to the Middle East, which you mentioned before here, and certainly since we've had you on the last time, there was a pretty big incident. I wonder if you could kind of put us in context for us as someone who spent some time in the Middle East, in the Israeli attack on the Hamas negotiators in Qatar. We showed earlier, I don't know that we still have it up there, but Benjamin Netanyahu made a really in-your-face denunciation of Qatar and accusing them of harboring terrorists, and said, yeah, you guys are either going to do what we say and get rid of these terrorists on your own, or we'll be doing this even some more. What shot across the bow to Middle East diplomacy does that give, and what does that mean for the process of ever ending this war with Hamas and the Palestinian people?
I think Prime Minister Netanyahu delivered an even more ominous and threatening message, which was that Israel does not respect the sovereignty of any country in its region, and reserves the right and has the intention of violating their sovereignty at will when it considers that to be to its advantage. I'll make a number of other comments about this particular attack on the Hamas delegation, which was assembled in Doha, the capital of Qatar, to consider an American proposal, probably written by the Israelis, for a resolution of the Gaza conflict. So this is a pattern. We now see several examples of it. Negotiators from Iran who are planning to go to Muscat to meet with the United States to discuss a resolution of our differences, see that meeting used as concealment for an attack by Israel, a surprise attack, a sort of false reassurance. We now see the same pattern with the Hamas delegation in Qatar. The United States is part of a ruse attracting Hamas to a location where they can be concentrated and murdered. We see a pattern. If you negotiate with Israel, Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh, assassinated in Iran, in Tehran, he was there as a state guest at the inauguration of the new Iranian president, Pezeshkian, murdered by the Israelis. And it doesn't appear that the United States and Donald Trump, our president, object in any respect to these assassinations and to our complicity in facilitating them. After all, in his first term of office, Donald Trump, president of the United States, assassinated Soleimani, the Iranian general who was in Baghdad to discuss peace, and was instead snuffed by us. So that's the first thing. Second thing, this means several things. Nobody is going to trust the Israelis to negotiate anything in good faith. Anybody who still does has now been disabused of that notion. Second, an American involvement with the Israelis in a so-called peace process now promises to be nothing but cover for a surprise attack. Our credibility is shot in diplomatic terms. Let me make one final comment. The United States has the largest base in the Middle East in Qatar at Al Udeid. There are 11,000 servicemen there. The Qataris very cleverly built that base for us. It's a Qatari base that they loaned to us, right in the middle of territory they disputed with Saudi Arabia. So they got us apparently on their side in that dispute. That base has now been the subject of an Iranian symbolic, not serious, counterattack following the American bombing in collusion with Israel of Iran. That base has now served no useful purpose in defending Qatar. It apparently either was unable to detect the Israeli attack on Doha, or it was in on the job. The Qataris must be thinking seriously about the future of that base. They certainly don't want to depend anymore on the United States to defend them. There's a $42 billion set of contracts for American air defenses and so forth with Qatar. Lockheed Martin and I think RTX are the major beneficiaries of this. I wouldn't be surprised to see those contracts turned over to the Chinese, who care seriously about sovereignty and who now have the technology to replicate what our systems can do, or maybe even improve on it. People have been very dubious about the value of American protection in the region. Iran takes out a drone in the Strait of Hormuz. Donald Trump shrugs. The Houthis, who are supplied by Iran, although not directed by it, take out Abqaiq, the main oil transfer facility in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. Donald Trump says, well, that's a Saudi problem, not ours. What are we out there for in terms of the local interest in this? I'd ask what we're out there for for any reason. What are we defending? American interests? Very unclear. We used to try to defend oil, but we're now an oil exporter. Last time I looked, we're a competitor, not a consumer of oil from that region. Are we protecting Israel? Does Israel protect us? Or does Israel act without regard to American interests and delight in causing problems for us with other friends, so-called friends? So, I think what has happened, this was a very important event, almost as important as the meeting in Tianjin between the members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which basically brought together pretty much all of Eurasia other than Europe in opposition to American dictates. We are, to go back to the theme that you struck at the outset, we're behaving as though reality doesn't exist, as though reality is defined by our own delusions of it, and that we can go on, we can punish anybody, a career person, military or civilian, diplomat or intelligence officer, for conveying an opinion of what reality is that doesn't conform to our misperception of it. And we are flying blind. And that is not good.
And then final question is, what do you think it would take? I'm guessing we're not there yet, even with this attack on Qatar, but that we may be getting close to it. The question is how close to a time to where it's Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, any of the others, Kuwait, to say, the Jews ain't worth the squeeze, and we're going to break ties. Because remember, Trump was in the Middle East just a few months ago, and had this big celebratory, and he was feted like a king, come to town, etc. Signed all these big deals, etc. But could there be a point to where these countries altogether that are kind of friendly to us go, yeah, not worth it anymore, and turn against us? Is that possible?
I think there's been a process on their part of diversifying their reliance on foreign partners away from overdependence on the United States. This has gone on ever since 2011 and the so-called Arab Spring, when we pitched Mubarak of Egypt over the transom and fed him to the sharks rather than protecting him. And we've otherwise had a very difficult relationship, sometimes caused by people in the area. Mohammed bin Salman clearly was complicit in the murder of my friend Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. And we had a bad period in relations with him under the Biden administration. Now, Donald Trump has more or less patched that up. But there's been a process going on. The Arabs are meeting right now in Doha to consider exactly the question you raised. How can we defend ourselves in a circumstance where the Americans appear to be in league with our principal enemy, which is Israel? I mean, Israel is now the focus of an effort by the Arabs and by Iran. They're being driven into the arms of Iran in order to balance Israel and its total disregard for international law, sovereignty, and the lives of the people around it. So having said all of that, I think the Arabs are very reluctant to retain their dependence on us, but there isn't anybody who can replace us militarily. We are the only people dumb enough to project forces into the Persian Gulf and have the capability to do it. And nobody else wants to do it, and they don't have the capability. The Chinese, for example, the Russians, they have other things on their hands. Now, they don't want to get involved in all that. We're dumb enough to do so. So, in fact, you spent some time out there as a result of that. They don't want this, but, I once gave a talk in which I pointed out that in Islam, you can have 4 wives. You don't have to have a Catholic marriage to one. And there may have been a Catholic marriage to the United States, and we may be too big to throw out of the bed, but there's some other people in there now. There are other partners. And I think this process has probably just been accelerated. Having said all that, however, and I'll end on this note, the rulers of the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, the Arab countries of the Persian Gulf, do not have a reputation for decisiveness, courage, boldness of strategic thinking, or anything else. These are very cautious, risk-averse people. So whatever they do is going to be pretty sneaky and slow. It's not going to be out there for us to object to.
Got it. Well, that certainly makes sense, and there's definitely a history of that too. But I think probably at the least we can think that there might be a few more folks in that bed, so that if they ever do need to get rid of the big one, there's other bodies to keep it warm. So we'll continue to watch and see what happens with it. And we really appreciate you coming on with this expertise today, both in the Middle East and as well as in Europe. Thank you very much.
No problem. Glad to be with you.
And we appreciate you guys too. And would ask one more time, if you wouldn't mind, like and subscribe before you leave. It helps us more than you know. We really appreciate you. We'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.